Today we're going to step back and review how you take care of your tomato plants, your pepper plants, and the amendments you'll want to use in your garden. Hi, my name's Jeremy, and today we're continuing in our Gardening with Carl series as we sit down with Carl in his living room to hear him explain and sort of review some of the items that he's covered, as well as share some additional helpful tips and insights that you may not have known about. Also, Carl will share with us how to care for your pepper plants in such a way that you can encourage a greater yield. So let's join Carl now as he explains.
Well, I'm so happy today to welcome you into my home. We're going to be staying here in the house today because it's really cold. I don't know, we've got this terrible freeze actually this morning, and many people I noticed up and down in my neighborhood have been putting sheets and things around some of their plants. Fortunately, I have nothing in my garden that I had to protect, so except one plant, and I was able to successfully do that. But today I want to just spend a few moments reviewing some of the concepts that we expressed in our last segment about tomatoes when we planted the tomato plant. And I want to just mainly review some things because it's so important, some of these principles that you might use in order to really succeed in having success with your tomato plants. I brought up here one of my tomato plants that I plan to transplant this next week because our forecast and the weather is supposed to be pretty good from now on. And this plant is a good illustration of what you might have before you place it in the ground. And I want to show you and review, because we talked about some of this in our last segment. But what you want to do is break off any limbs down here, because the main thing in tomato planting is you want to plant it either deep, or at least the major part of the plant must be under the ground, because what we're striving for is roots. We want to make sure that our tomato plant takes advantage of its ability to have lots of roots. I'm going to show you the difference between a tomato plant and a pepper plant. Even though they're in the same family, they're nightshade family, just like several other things that we plant. But on the tomato plant, unlike any other nightshade, they have these little hairs along the stem all the way up, because the tomato plant in its natural state, where they first discovered it in Peru and South America, the tomato plant is a sprawler. It's not a plant that normally grows straight up. Now, it looks straight up, but what happens is it begins to bend and in its natural state, and it begins to crawl. It sprawls all over the ground and can cover quite a bit of square feet, in territory. And what happens is that at every node here, and all along the stem, as it touches the ground, it will produce roots. And you can have a plant in which, when you walk around and begin to pull the stem up, you will see that it has roots that are attaching it to the ground. So we plant our plant so that all the way up to here might be under the ground. And you might remember, if you watched the last segment, that because the soil is still very cold, I didn't want to plant it real deep, because the cold soil will actually cause the plant to just stop growing until it warms up, and that's not really an advantage in planting it early. So I plant it very shallow, but I do lay the whole plant down in the ground laterally like that, and then I bend this up and it begins to grow straight up. And this whole area that is under the ground is producing roots. And that's what you want. You want to take advantage of its ability to do that. Now, when you do that, of course, you break all of this off. And when this begins to grow up, what's going to happen very naturally is that in every one of these little joints right here, they call this the armpit of the plant. Right here, every one of these little joints here will produce a sapling or a little sprout, and you want to break those off. Unless when this part that's above the ground grows up high enough, then you want to, maybe depending on how many liters you want, you will allow to grow. And that's something that I wanted to review with you so that you might know. Now, when you are planting a tomato plant, there's several things very important if you want to succeed once it's planted. First of all, you want to have a good mulch. And the reason we have a mulch is because when you water, you don't want the soil which has pathogens that can cause disease. You don't want the soil to splash up on any of the leaves. And so there's several things you want to keep in mind. As the plant is growing, you want to make sure that there are no leaves close to the ground. I will take, for instance, when this grows, and eventually this plant will have no limbs, no leaves coming down below about this height, and this would be the level of the soil. And I would have mulch here. And the other principle, due to the same thing that's happening here, is you want to know when to water your plant. It's very important that you not water it later in the day or especially toward evening, because if it's wet at night, it doesn't dry like it would during the day. But people who grow tomatoes successfully know that the best time to water tomatoes is early in the morning. And the way you water tomatoes is very important. You want to soak the soil and then let it rest for 3 or 4 days. And the way that you check to find out if it needs water is to take your finger and poke it down into the soil about 3 inches. And if the tip of your finger reaches soil that you can tell is moist, then you don't need to water it. Now the top of it might be dry, but if you reach down 2 or 3 inches and your finger reaches moist soil, then you know that it still has enough water. And a tomato plant does not like to be wet all the time. It actually is benefited by a drying process and then watering. And then it drinks the water much more beneficially. So I hope that helps in your success in growing your tomato. Now I want to show you the differences in tomatoes and peppers, because just because a pepper is a nightshade, you don't plant them the same way that you would plant a tomato. For instance, when you plant a pepper plant, you don't bend it down like I suggested that you do with your tomato, and you don't necessarily plant it deep. You simply plant it, and you will notice that when you look at the stem, it has none of those hairs that produce roots on those stems over there on the tomato plant. It's just shiny and regular stem. And yet, when you plant your tomato plant, due to the fact that you want the lower part of it to be so that nothing splashes up on the leaves, you want to cut these leaves and allow your plant to grow and have no leaves lower than about 8 inches. And then another thing you want to do is when you plant your plant, and if it's about this size, you want to clip the top. If you prune the top of your plant, that very top bud, if if you trim that, cut it off, then your plant will begin to grow branches that will come out, and you will produce a lot more peppers that way. So your pepper plant is different than a tomato plant, and yet in the same family. And it's the same thing goes for pepper plant, and for everything that you possibly can in your garden, you should mulch. And there are several things that you use for mulching, and I would imagine that you already know that. I like to use grass clippings for my mulch. I also will rake up the remnants of oak leaves bordering my property, and I use that for mulch too. And much of the stuff that takes place when I mow my lawn, I will collect that and let it dry, and then I put it around my plants. And it's very beneficial, because when you use a mulch, it encourages the worms to come up to the top, and they will munch on the deteriorating mulch, and will create a very fertile substance around that soil and around your plant. So I just wanted to kind of review that with you, and to make sure that you understand how important those particular things are. Now, something really important is companion planting. You can plant certain companion type things around your tomato plant that really benefit your tomato plant. In other words, will help. As some of you, I'm sure, know, one of the worst things that can happen to your tomato plant is the hornworm, the tomato hornworm. If a tomato hornworm gets on your plant, it can literally eat this whole top portion in 3 days' time. And so you don't want to have that happen to your tomato plant. And one of the things you can do that will really help you with dealing with these hornworms is to plant dill. Plant some dill at the base of your plant. I'm going to be planting dill around the base of my tomato plants, because dill attracts a small wasp that lays its eggs in this hornworm that gets on your tomato plant. And those, when they lay their eggs on this hornworm, within 3 or 4 days, those eggs have hatched, and that hornworm has been given a death sentence. So I'm going to be planting dill. Now, there are other things you can plant. Marigold plants, the French marigolds, especially the orange French marigold plants, give off a scent that discourages certain types of things like whiteflies and aphids and things that can also devastate your plant. Peppermint, if you plant peppermint, don't plant it in the soil in your garden, because it's so invasive. It will just spread like wildfire, and you don't want that. It's hard to get rid of once it gets going. So what you want to do is plant it in a pot at the base of your plant if you want to use it, because peppermint throws off a scent that will discourage certain things that will hurt your tomato plant. Basil is another good companion plant, parsley and chives. All of these, the scent of these various plants seem to drive away the harmful insects that might attack your tomato plant. So I hope that helps as you consider growing tomatoes this year. Now, what I'd like to do next is just simply show you some of the amendments that I use in my garden. I'm not suggesting necessarily that you need or have to purchase any of these, but it will just give you some idea of where I'm going when it comes to enriching my soil around my growing plants. I'd like to begin by talking about Azomite. I have a little Azomite in this jar. It's a very fine powder, almost like talcum powder. But Azomite comes from a lake bed, an old ancient lake bed in Utah, where they mine it and they break it down, and it's been found to have an incredible number of very helpful minerals that are depleted in our soils. And so it's something that I add to everything I do. In fact, I like to do this at the beginning of the growing season in my entire garden by just spreading a little bit. It's like remineralizing my soil, which is very important. Most of our soils are very deficient in certain things, and so this really helps to balance it out. But I actually also will take a little bit of this and put it in every hole, and when I transplant a tomato plant or a pepper plant, or even my vegetables, so like lettuce plants, broccoli, cabbage, all of those things, I will put just a little bit of azomite in there because I want that great broad balance of many things that are going to make it more tasty and especially more nutritious. And these minerals will help to do that. Of course, another source of minerals is the sea. And the ocean down below California, between Mexico, in fact, I think it belongs to Mexico, is said to have the purest water because there are no cities that emit anything into that part of the ocean. And so what they've done is they've collected salt from that part of the ocean, and that salt contains over 80 different minerals that you won't find, in any other substance at that mass amount. And I use that sometimes, but azomite's a little easier to use. And then I have to mention Blackstrap Molasses. Blackstrap Molasses, you may wonder, how do you use that? Well, I use this mainly in my compost tea. And yet, once in a while, if you really want to give a plant a boost, and especially if you have a mulch under the plant, you might want to mix a couple of tablespoons of this and a couple of gallons of water, and with a watering can, water beneath your plant. And this mixture under the plant in the soil right next to your mulch will feed the earthworms and all of the microbes that are there feeding your plant. So it's a very helpful thing, and a lot of people like to use it. I want to show you a few other things, like for instance, one of my favorites happens to be Alfalfa Meal. Now, Alfalfa Meal, I was really happy to find out that I can buy Alfalfa Meal at Tractor Supply. And it's not actually produced there for the benefit of gardeners, but more for horse feed. And yet it's the very same product. And let me tell you why I buy it there. I get this 50-pound bag for $17. Now, if you go on the internet and if you purchase Alfalfa Meal, let's say from Amazon, you will get 5 pounds for $22. 5 pounds for $22. I checked on this. And there are other places that sell it in the packs. For instance, one of the groups, one of the places is called Dr. Earth. They sell 3 pounds for $17. And I got 50 pounds for $17. They are pellets. And it's one of the finest, most natural nitrogen amendments that you can place in your garden. I like to spread it all over my garden, but I put just a small little handful every once in a while in some of the holes when I plant, especially leaf type vegetables like collards and lettuce and cabbage and those types of things. I use this for that, and it makes them very green, it makes them very colorful, because it's a very, one of the finest amendments that you can use. And then one of my favorites happens to be Kelp Meal. Kelp Meal, of course, comes from the sea, and anything from the sea you're going to find has just an enormous number of these mass variety of nutrients for the soil. And I always put just a little bit of kelp meal in my holes. And it's good for tomatoes because it's high in soluble potash, a little lower in nitrogen, and that's the ideal for tomatoes and anything that has flowers and bears fruit. And so it's a perfect amendment for tomatoes and peppers and all of those things that bear fruit. Espoma produces all kinds of amendments for plants for your garden, and one of their best, I think, is this organic gardening plant food, vegetable food, just a general fertilizer that's a natural organic fertilizer, has a lot of extra things in it. But there are two of these, and one of them has, this one here has 3 nitrogen, 4 phosphate, and 4 potash, and then it's more ideal for your tomatoes than this particular one. They have 2. This one is more one that has more nitrogen in it, and you would use this more for your leafy plants. Just keep that in mind. Now, talking about nitrogen, here's one, blood meal. If you are, inclined to have something that's not vegetarian, I mean, we get into an animal type product. Blood meal is a very powerful nitrogen, and it does many things other than that I won't go into that are good in the garden. And then I have another product here that's called Seaweed plant food, and you can just get all kinds of things like that will really boost your plants. Now, I want to just show you this particular product because it's pure phosphate, triple super phosphate. And the reason I'm showing you this is I like to, when I plant my tomatoes, take just a very small little handful and drop it in the bottom of the hole. And then I cover that with about 2 inches of soil and then put my plant in there. Why do I do that? Because once this gets to growing real well, this here is what really will boost the flower growing and the tomato production, the fruit production. So that's why I do that. But I have, I think I've pretty well shown you everything. The other animal type product would be bat guano. I'm sure you've heard of that. Bat guano is just full of all kinds of nutrients and very rich. You have to be a little careful when you apply it because of its richness. It's liable to sometimes burn the plant, they say. But and then there's green sand. Now I use green sand because it's very good for this part of the plant. Makes this nice and solid and larger and much stronger. And so I put a tiny bit of green sand into my tomato hole. All right, so I think that pretty well does it with my amendments. I wanted to just share that with you.
I hope you found today's presentation helpful, and if so, please, again, won't you subscribe to this channel and give us a thumbs up. And most of all, we'd love to hear from you. Give us your comments on what you would like to see us address in the future, or maybe you have some questions that you'd like to have clarified. We'll do our best to respond. Also, if you'd like more information on some of the items that he listed in the amendments section, then just check out the description below where we've posted some helpful links. So please, join us next week as together we explore greener pastures.